It's quite an extraordinary sound. Maybe it's the magic of those two incredible female voices blending together. Chemistry, that's the soul of ABBA. And suddenly, the world was dancing to their music. But behind the glitter, the fame, and the timeless hits, there was another story. One that wasn't told on stage. ABBA wasn't just a band. It was two real-life couples whose love stories became as famous as their songs. And now, decades after their split, Agnetha Faltskog is finally revealing the heartbreaking truth about the end of her marriage with fellow bandmate Björn Ulvaeus. ABBA conquered the world with their charm, their dazzling performances, and their unforgettable melodies. Yet, while millions adored their music, few knew about the quiet storm that was brewing behind the scenes, a story of love, loss, and the painful reality of fame. Agnetha, the radiant blonde whose voice could melt hearts, and Björn, the creative mastermind behind many of ABBA's hits, seemed like the perfect couple. Their marriage was the dream every fan believed in, a fairy tale of two stars united by music and destiny. But what looked like perfection on stage was slowly falling apart off it. The smiles, the matching outfits, the duets filled with emotion, they were all part of a performance hiding a growing distance between two people once madly in love. As ABBA climbed the charts, their personal lives began to crumble. What really happened between Agnetha and Björn? What led to the heartbreak that shaped not only their love story but also the music that defined an entire generation? Stay tuned, because this isn't just a story about a band, it's a story about passion, pain, and the price of fame that no one saw coming. Agnetha and Björn's love began when both were still at the start of their careers. At that time, Björn was already a recognized songwriter, while Agnetha was a rising star in Sweden's music scene. During the 1970s, the world was in awe of the talent and dedication of ABBA, a band formed by two couples who would go on to become the most iconic musical act of the decade. Their rise to fame truly began in April 1974, when they won the Eurovision Song Contest with Waterloo. But few know that the first spark had been lit almost 8 years earlier. In the summer of 1966, Björn Ulvaeus, then a member of the folk group the Hootenanny Singers, met Benny Andersson, who played with the Hepstars, Sweden's #1 pop band at the time. The two groups happened to cross paths while touring the country's open-air folk park circuit. After a few friendly conversations, Björn and Benny discovered they shared the same creative passion. Later that summer, at another party, they decided to try writing a song together. The result was Isn't It Easy to Say, a modest tune that would later be recorded by the Hepstars, and unknowingly, it planted the very first seed of what would later bloom into ABBA. By 1969, Benny decided to leave the Hepstars. Together with Björn, he continued writing and recording songs under the encouragement of Stig Andersson, a record label owner who would later become ABBA's manager. Stig believed wholeheartedly in their talent, assuring them that their music would one day reach global success. His words became the push and motivation they needed to keep going. Following their first single, Björn and Benny released a second one titled Hedge, Gamla Man, Hey Old Man, featuring backing vocals by their fiancées, Agnetha Faltskog and Annifrid Lyngstad, Frida. This moment marked the very first time all four future members of ABBA appeared together on the same recording, the true beginning of their musical destiny. Frida had met Benny earlier that year, in March 1969, while performing in Malmö, in southern Sweden. Agnetha, on the other hand, was already a successful solo singer, though she found herself entangled in a complicated relationship with Dieter Zimmermann, a man who had proposed to her. At first, the shy and innocent Agnetha accepted the proposal. But as time went on, she began to sense something wasn't right. The relationship started to lose its warmth and sincerity, and one day, Agnetha accidentally overheard a conversation between Dieter and someone else. That was the moment she realized the shocking truth. Their entire engagement had been a setup. Heartbroken but stronger, Agnetha walked away. She didn't know it then, but that decision would change her life forever. Because soon after, fate would lead her to Björn, and together, they would create one of the greatest love stories and musical legacies the world has ever known, ABBA. Agnetha thought she had found love, but what she didn't know was that her engagement was nothing more than a carefully arranged publicity stunt. At just 19 years old, she was engaged to Dieter Zimmermann, a man twice her age, already 40, and the entire relationship was orchestrated to give her a bit of fame in Germany. It wasn't love. It was business. Stig and B, who were at a radio station with Benny, got talking about Agnetha Fältskog. Benny told the men how he and Agnetha Fältskog were planning on taking their relationship seriously. When he mentioned that, B was surprised, asking him what the seriousness was for. In response, Benny told him that it actually doesn't matter, since all relationships work at their own pace. All of a sudden, just while the conversation was going on, Benny then called Bun's attention to the song that was playing on the radio and asked us to turn the volume up. Immediately they heard a young female voice singing through the radio. The three of them were left in shock and admiration for the voice they heard, especially B. At that point, BU was more like someone who had fallen in love with someone he barely knew. Just after the song ended, he suddenly asked who the girl was and wanted to see a picture of her. In response, they told him that Agnetha Fältskog sang it, so Bern requested if he could meet Agnetha. Benny immediately mentioned that Bern was obsessed, and B responded that he thought he was in love. The other two wondered how come he was already in love with someone he had not even seen. While the whole conversation was going on, B was shown a picture of Agnetha, but Ste, on the other hand, broke the news of her supposed engagement to him. However, they thought among themselves that the only good side of it was the fact that the man looked so much older than Agnetha herself, so maybe her relationship with this man won't last any longer. At that point, B was more determined than ever to meet Agnetha. Even though she was engaged, Agnetha had first moved to Stockholm almost 2 years ago after Little Gart, the man who discovered her and offered her a recording contract. At that time, she was the lead singer of a local dance band while also working as a switchboard operator at the local car dealer. It was from here that AG started writing her first song that talked about her first love and how it ended in heartbreak. The song was called Jagger Sar. Following the news of her failed engagement, she decided to move back to her parents. On a fateful day, she decided to listen to the radio, and the song that came up was an old song by the Hoot and Nanny Singers. Just like most teenage girls at the time, Agnetha was very fond of the Hoot Nanny Singers as well as the End Stars. In fact, a few of her friends even had a crush on B, and so did Agnetha, but she was too embarrassed to admit it, and she felt that there was no way B would be interested in a girl like her. Aside from that, the news of her engagement was all over the Swedish and German newspapers. Ern, on the other hand, was back at the studio with Benny when Ste disclosed the news that they've booked a spot for B on the Jill Ceylon special for next week. He would be one of the main performers, but the sweetest part was that he would be performing alongside Agnetha Fältskog in a duet by May 1969. Just when the two of them appeared in the same show, this was the very first time Agnetha and BR would meet. It was a magical moment for the both of them, as they even went ahead to have their very first kiss on that same day. As sweet as their relationship and bond felt, the double-edged sword of fame led to some struggles. Let's get into the details. It was at the cabaret act Festfolk where the ABBA couples first introduced themselves to the public. In May 1969, under the bright lights of that show, Bjorn and Agnetha met for the very first time. The chemistry was instant, the kind of connection that can't be scripted or planned. By the end of that magical night, they even shared their first kiss. It was the beginning of something beautiful and tragic. Their love would soon be tested by fame, pressure, and the impossible weight of being part of one of the biggest bands in the world. Because while ABBA was born out of love, it was also love that would one day tear it apart. Their love was the kind of story that seemed written in the stars. Two rising icons, young, beautiful, and talented, bound together by music and destiny. To the world, Agnetha Faltskog and Bjorn Ulvaeus were not just lovers. They were the beating heart of ABBA, the band that redefined pop music forever. But behind the perfect harmonies and radiant smiles was a love that, little by little, began to fall apart. It all began in July 1971, when Agnetha and Bjorn exchanged vows in a beautiful summer wedding. Sweden adored them, the golden couple who sang of love, hope, and dreams. Benny Andersson and Annie Frid Lingstad, Frida, were also deeply in love at the time, and together the four of them seemed unstoppable. Bjorn and Benny had just started working as producers at Stig Andersson's record label, while Agnetha released a successful solo album, capturing hearts across the country. Their connection was electric, their bond unshakable. Every melody they wrote, every lyric they sang, felt like a reflection of their love story. Soon, Stig decided to give them a collective name, ABBA, taken from the first letters of their names: Agnetha, Bjorn, Benny, and Annie Frid. None of them knew that this name would one day echo through history. In 1972, ABBA recorded their first official single, People Need Love. It became a top 20 hit in Sweden, a sign that something big was coming. Just a year later, they entered the Eurovision Song Contest with Ring Ring, written by Björn, Benny, and Stig. Although they didn't win, the song marked the beginning of their meteoric rise. At the time, Agnetha was pregnant with their first child, little Linda, and the public saw her as the embodiment of grace and strength, a woman balancing motherhood and stardom. But the truth was far more complicated. As ABBA's fame skyrocketed, the cracks in their marriage began to show. Björn's passion for perfection became an obsession. He spent countless hours in the studio, writing, composing, and producing, chasing an impossible standard of success. Agnetha, however, longed for peace, for quiet mornings with her children, for a life where she could simply be a wife and a mother. By the time their second child, Christian, was born, ABBA was on top of the world. They had won Eurovision 1974 with Waterloo, their music topping charts everywhere. But for Agnetha, the pressure was suffocating. The constant travel, interviews, and performances left her physically and emotionally drained. And then there was her fear of flying, something Björn never fully understood. Every tour announcement filled her with dread. To the fans, she was the glowing pop princess, but behind the curtain, she was trembling, exhausted, and desperate for stability. The emotional distance between them grew silently but steadily. At home, the laughter faded. Conversations turned to arguments, and arguments turned to silence. While Björn threw himself deeper into his work, Agnetha sought comfort in the only place that still felt safe: her children and the quiet countryside. As ABBA's fame reached its golden peak, their marriage was quietly crumbling. The love songs they performed together, songs that once came from genuine affection, began to sound like echoes of a happiness long gone. By 1978, the tension had become unbearable. Agnetha felt unseen, unheard, and unloved. The man she had once adored, the gentle, attentive dreamer, now seemed lost in ambition. She later revealed that she would often sit alone in hotel rooms, crying after performances, wondering when the Björn she fell in love with had disappeared. Then, in early 1979, Agnetha made the painful decision to end their marriage. "I felt like a shadow," she confessed later. "Our love had turned into something I couldn't recognize anymore." The world was stunned when news of their separation broke. Fans refused to believe it. How could ABBA's perfect couple, the faces of joy, love, and unity, be falling apart? What made it even harder was what came next. Only weeks after their split, Björn entered a new relationship. For Agnetha, it was like reliving the heartbreak all over again. Not only had she lost the man she loved, but she had to watch him move on quickly, publicly, and without looking back. And yet, despite the pain, the show had to go on. In January 1979, ABBA released Chiquitita, performing it live at the UNICEF Gala in New York. The song became one of their biggest hits, a symbol of hope and compassion. But for Agnetha, it was the saddest performance of her life. The cameras captured her smile, but behind it were tears no one could see. From the outside, everything looked perfect: four shining stars, singing in harmony, conquering the world. But behind the stage lights, two hearts were drifting further apart. Agnetha later said in an interview, "Fame changed him. The man I loved, the man who used to hold me, laugh with me, and dream with me, he was gone. There is nothing worse than feeling invisible to the person you love." ABBA would continue to make music together for a few more years, but the magic between them had already faded. The songs grew sadder, more nostalgic echoes of a love that once was. And when the curtain finally fell, what remained wasn't just a broken marriage, but a legacy, a story of passion, sacrifice, and two people whose love gave birth to one of the greatest bands in music history. Because while ABBA's music will live forever, the love that inspired it had already sung its final note. They smiled for the cameras, posed for magazine covers, and sang love songs side by side, but it was all a performance. Behind those perfect harmonies, Agnetha Faltskog was living through heartbreak in silence. While the world saw ABBA's golden couple shining bright, she felt herself fading away. Björn's drive was relentless. His ambition knew no limits. To him, ABBA was everything: a mission, a legacy, an empire he couldn't afford to lose. But to Agnetha, it became a cage. Though she stood before thousands of adoring fans, she had never felt more alone. Every applause felt distant, every spotlight colder. She once recalled a night that perfectly captured the breaking point, a rare evening when they were finally alone, free from the chaos of fame. She opened her heart to him, begging him to understand her need for peace and balance. But Bjorn, ever the pragmatist, brushed her off. "We have to stay strong for ABBA," he said. Those words cut deeper than she could ever admit. It was as if her feelings no longer mattered, as if her love, her pain, her voice had all been drowned out by the sound of ambition. Years later, Agnetha would describe how that moment marked the beginning of the end. She felt trapped, suffocated by a life that looked perfect from the outside but was falling apart from within. And when the marriage finally ended, the grief that followed was like losing a piece of herself. What hurt most wasn't just the separation, it was realizing that Bjorn had already moved on, almost as if their love story had been just another chapter in the ABBA saga. The media didn't help. Headlines called her the abandoned wife, painting her as a tragic figure while Bjorn was celebrated for his creative genius. Yet, despite her pain, Agnetha continued to perform. For the sake of the band, they had to keep going, singing together while their hearts drifted further apart. On stage, they smiled. Off stage, silence. Their once playful glances became polite nods. Their laughter turned into formality. The tension was so visible that even fans began to sense something had changed. For Agnetha, it wasn't just about losing her husband, it was about losing herself. She had given everything, her voice, her time, her dreams, to sustain a love that no longer existed. Bjorn, meanwhile, often spoke of creative success that came from their emotional turmoil, calling it part of ABBA's magic. But for Agnetha, those songs were not just hits, they were wounds set to melody. When ABBA quietly ended after their final public performance in 1982, there was no official announcement, no farewell. The music stopped, and silence filled the space where their love once lived. Afterward, Agnetha withdrew from the spotlight, choosing solitude over stardom. Her solo albums were deeply personal, raw reflections of heartbreak, healing, and rediscovery. Each song was like a page torn from her diary. Leaving wasn't just about ending a marriage, she later said. It was about finding myself again. Bjorn, on the other hand, poured his emotions into work, writing musicals, composing, and chasing new projects. But even then, the shadow of his relationship with Agnetha followed him everywhere. Every time ABBA reunited, fans couldn't help but look for signs, a glance, a spark, a moment that might suggest the wounds had healed. Time moved on, but some stories never truly end. Agnetha once confessed that there were days she questioned her decision, days she wondered if walking away had been right. But deep down, she knew the truth: if she hadn't left, she would have lost herself completely. Her departure wasn't an act of defeat, it was an act of self-respect. And in reclaiming her peace, she also reclaimed her voice. Through her music, she rebuilt her life, note by note, lyric by lyric, until the woman who once sang of heartbreak was singing again about freedom. It's a story not just about the fall of a marriage, but about the rise of a woman who learned to stand alone, and in doing so, became truly timeless. Sparkles, if you found this story moving, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the next chapter in ABBA's unforgettable legacy.